Hey there, welcome. Today, we're going to jump right into the basics of SQL. It's basically the language that powers our entire digital world, letting us talk to the huge databases that store, well, pretty much everything. So let's just dive right in with a big question. Every single time you post a photo, search for something, or even just log into an app, you're creating data. But where does all that stuff actually go? To figure that out, we've got to get a handle on how all this information is managed at, a massive scale. And that brings us to the whole idea of data storage. See, to make any sense of this tidal wave of information, it needs a system, some kind of structure. So let's take a look at how it's all organized. At the very heart of it all is the database. The best way to think of it is like a gigantic, perfectly organized digital filing cabinet. And I mean perfectly organized. It's not just some random pile of info. It's all set up so you can find, add, or change things super fast and easy. But here's the thing. You don't talk to that filing cabinet directly. You need a manager, right? Like go-between? Well, that's the Database Management System, or DBMS for short. It's the software that basically takes your requests, figures out what you want, and then does all the heavy lifting in the database for you. So how does a database actually keep all this stuff organized? Well, a lot of the time, it uses tables. And honestly, the best way to picture this is like an old school class register. Each student gets their own row, and all their details, name, ID, whatever, are in the columns. It's a really simple idea, but it's super powerful for keeping things neat and tight. Okay, so we've got our filing cabinet, the database, and our manager, the DBMS. The next obvious question is, how do we actually talk to the manager? We need to speak a language it can understand. So databases basically come in two main flavors. On one hand, you've got your relational databases like MySQL, which use that super strict table structure we just talked about, think spreadsheets. And on the other hand, you have non-relational databases, which people often call NoSQL. These are way more flexible and awesome for less structured data, like, say, your social media feed. Now, for what we're doing today, we're going to focus on the relational kind, because that's where the most popular data language in the world comes into play. And that language is SQL, which stands for Structured Query Language. It's pretty much the universal standard for asking questions, adding info, and just managing all the data inside those table-based relational databases. Bottom line, if you want to talk to data, you've got to learn SQL. Okay, enough theory, right? Let's get our hands dirty. We're going to walk through a tiny little project and have our very first chat with a database using just a few simple SQL commands. And this whole conversation basically has 4 simple steps. First, we make a container for our data. Then we set up the table inside it, kind of like setting up columns in a spreadsheet. After that, we pop some data in, and finally, we just ask the database to show us what we did. Our first command is just beautiful. It's so simple. It reads almost like plain English. We're just telling the system, create database college. And bam, just like that, our digital filing cabinet pops into existence. All right, next up, we build the structure inside that database. We tell it to create table student, and then we define our columns. We'll have an ID column, which we're telling it is an int for integer, a whole number. And then we'll add a name column. We'll set that as varchar 50, which is just a fancy way of saying it can hold text up to 50 characters long. Yeah, an empty table is pretty boring, so let's add our first student. The command is insert into student, and then we give it the values in the right order. 101 for the ID, and Karan for the name. And just like that, our first student is in the system. And now, for the grand finale, the big reveal. We ask the database to select everything. That's what that little star symbol, the asterisk, means, from our student table. We're pretty much just saying, hey, show me everything you've got in there. And look at that. Here's the result. The database totally understood every single command, followed all our instructions perfectly, and gave us back the exact data we put in. We had a successful conversation. How cool is that? Okay, so managing one little table, super easy. But what happens when our college database starts to grow? What if we add another table for, say, courses? We need a really solid way to connect students to the courses they're taking. And that's where these special columns called keys come in. They're all about building relationships. Okay, let's break this down. Think about a users table on a website. Every single person needs a unique ID, right? Like a user number. That's the primary key. It's a one-of-a-kind identifier that makes sure we never mix up two different people. Now let's say we have another table for posts. To know who wrote each post, we add a user ID column to that table. Well, that user ID column is a foreign key. Why? Because it points all the way back to the primary key in the users table. It's the critical link that connects a post to its author. It's how everything stays connected. And really, that brings us to the big so what of all this. In a world that is just overflowing with information, SQL is the tool that lets us create order out of chaos. It gives us the power to build structure, ask really smart questions, and turn all that digital noise into organized, useful knowledge. You know, we've really only just scratched the surface of what you can do with this, but hopefully it gives you a whole new way of looking at the digital world around you. So now that you know the language of data, the only question left is, what questions are you going to ask?